fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. What do we expect folks to do? I say, what is this system designed to do? Seems designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens. That is exactly what happens about 70% of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return in some states do so in a matter of months. The challenges associated with mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? What do we do? Well, one thing I think is clear is that those of us in the civil rights community, those of us in the faith community, we've allowed a human rights nightmare to occur on our watch. We have. We have. We have. While many advocates like myself have been clinging to affirmative action, trying to hang on to the so-called gangs of the past, millions of people rounded up, branded criminals and felons, and ushered into a permanent second-class status, stripped of the very rights many people gave their lives for. As a nation, we have spent over $1 trillion just waging the drug war alone. These funds could have been used for education in our schools. Those funds could have been used for job creation in the communities that need it most. We're always being told, well, there's no money for that. There's no money to pay our teachers well. There's no money for small class sizes. There's no money for after-school programs. There's no money for summer jobs for teenagers. There's no money. We have had $1 trillion extra to spend. And rather than investing in the collective well-being of our communities, we have set out on a path of destruction for so many poor folks of color, their lives, their families, and their dreams. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration and inspiring a recommitment to Dr. King's dream. Now, if you imagine something less will do, that we can adopt some reforms here or there, tinker with this machine and get it right, consider this. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are behind bars today. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities. Prisons are often sold to these communities as an answer to their economic woes. And very often, these prisons don't actually deliver to those communities all that's promised, but nonetheless, these communities think that their survival depends on these prisons. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange would be forced to watch their profits vanish. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away. It's not going to just fade away without some kind of major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know there's many people today who say there's no hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Just as many were resigned to Jim Crow in the South and said, oh, yeah, it's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that many people view the millions cycling in and out of our prisons and jails today as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I know that Dr. King and Ella Baker and Sojourner Truth would not have been so easily deterred. So we have got to be willing to go back, pick up where they left off, and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. Meaningful equality, he said, could not be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to shelter, the right to a quality education, without basic human rights, he said, civil rights are an empty promise. So in honor of Dr. King and all those who risked their lives to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we'll commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration. A movement, yes, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, a movement to end all these forms of discrimination against people released from prison that deny them their basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. So how do we get this movement? How do we get this movement really going? Well, first, I think we've got to begin by telling the truth, the whole truth. We have got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to rebirth a caste-like system. And we've got to be willing to tell this truth in our churches, in our schools, in our community centers, in our reentry centers. We have got to be willing to tell this truth so a great collective awakening can begin. But of course, just a lot of talk isn't going to get the job done. It's not going to be enough. We're going to have to be willing to speak up and speak out and tell and share the truth. But it's going to take more than that. We have got to be willing to get to work. We have got to be willing to build an underground railroad for people returning home from prison. We have got to be willing to open our churches, open our schools, open our community centers to people returning home from prison and their families and provide them a lifeline. Desperately needed support in fighting work and shelter and food and making sure they have access to education and the things they need to make a genuine break for freedom. But I find that often people will tell me who've been released from prison that church is the last place they'd go. They say, I don't feel welcome there. I don't feel welcome. Many people released from prison say that's the place they feel the most ashamed, most stigmatized. There is so much shame and stigma, shaming and blaming that goes on in our communities, that it makes collective political action next to impossible. So we have got to find a way to begin to open our arms, open our hearts to people returning home from prison and create safe places where people could admit out loud, yes, I've done time. Yes, my son is behind bars. How do we create those safe places? Well, I think it may begin by us telling the truth about our own criminality, admitting our own criminality out loud. Because the reality is we're all criminals. We're all sinners. We've all made mistakes in our lives. We've all done wrong. I find people will tell me, oh, don't call me a criminal. Don't call me a criminal. I'm not a criminal. I'll say, okay. Maybe you never drank underage. Maybe you never experimented with drugs. Maybe you never snatched a pack of gum from a convenience store when you were young. Maybe you never did any of those things. Well, if the worst thing you've done in your life is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you've put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of their living room. That's the truth. That's the truth. But here in the United States today, there are people serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses. Life sentences. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld life sentences for first-time drug offenses in a case called Harmland versus Michigan. It was challenged. That sentence was challenged on the grounds that such a sentence violated the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The U.S. Supreme Court said no. It doesn't violate the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a young man to life in prison for a first-time drug offense, even though virtually no other country in the world does such a thing. So we've got to end this sense that the criminals are them, not us. And recognize this is about all of us. We've got to be willing to say, there but for the grace of God, go I. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals and have made mistakes in our lives. But only some of us are being asked to pay for the rest of our lives for the mistakes we've made. But of course, just welcoming people into our homes, into our churches and schools isn't going to be enough, because just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to build an underground railroad. You had to be willing to work for abolition. Today, we have got to be willing to organize and work for an end to this system of mass incarceration as a whole. And that means ending the war on drugs once and for all. We have spent $1 trillion locking people up, locking them out, and yet rates of drug abuse and drug addiction remain largely unchanged. It is time to shift to a public health model of dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse, and invest those dollars in education, job creation, and drug treatment in the communities that need it most. And we've got to end all these forms of discrimination that keep people locked out for life, and shift from a purely punitive approach to dealing with violence in our communities to one that is more rehabilitative and restorative in nature, that gives people and entire communities a genuine second chance. So we've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of work to do, and if it feels like it's overwhelming, if it feels like it's too much, if you ask yourself, well, how can all of this possibly be done? Keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, practices that comprise this system of mass incarceration rest upon one core belief. And it's the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It's the belief that some of us are unworthy of genuine care, compassion, and concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And yes, it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, because although this drug war was born with black folks in mind, it has destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. And the divisive racial politics that birthed this drug war, they're leading to another prison building boom today. This one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. There's a private prison building boom going on today aimed at them. So we've got to be willing to connect the dots and build a human rights movement on behalf of all of us. But before this movement can even get underway, a great awakening is required. We've got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we have got to be willing to embrace those labeled criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much for having me here today.